I think the emphasis needs to be more on defending Australia's interests at this point in time, because even if China is no longer engaging in wolf warrior coercion of Australia as it did between 2015 and 2022, that hasn't changed their geostrategic goals and ambitions in terms of dominating the Indo-Pacific region. Beijing will take every opportunity to exploit our desire for stabilization. AUKUS is a technology sharing agreement. It's not a military alliance.
Hello, everyone. Today, we have a special guest joining us to discuss the main security threats in Asia. Also, the Western and Asian manufacturing bases and their varying potentials. We'll also explore the idea of Asia entering a pre-war phase and additional hurdles posed by the AUKUS alliance for Australia. Also, recent Wang Yi's visit to Australia. Plus the question, is Xi Jinping planning a historic trip to Australia? Welcome to the show.
Hi everyone. Today our guest is Malcolm Davis. He's a senior analyst with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Malcolm, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask you at the very beginning, what do you see now as the main security threats in Asia? How do you assess the situation?
Well, it's very clear that it's China is the main security threat. You have a rising China that is determined to challenge US influence and presence in the Indo-Pacific region, and ultimately to force the US out of the region and create a Chinese sphere of influence. Part of that process would involve China ultimately imposing unification on Taiwan through military force. I think the chances of peaceful unification are virtually nil because the vast majority of Taiwanese people don't want unification. So therefore, it's highly likely that within potentially as early as the second half of this decade, but certainly by the middle of the next decade, China will probably use military force to impose unification on Taiwan. And that potentially could lead to a major power war between China and the United States and its allies to defend Taiwan. Second big threat, of course, is the South China Sea, where China is using military force at what's known as the grey zone level to essentially coerce and intimidate states such as the Philippines to accept China's control of the South China Sea. 2015, China militarized disputed reefs and rocks in the South China Sea and built artificial bases, artificial islands on those reefs and rocks, and now has militarized them. So I think China wants ultimately to control the entirety of the South China Sea as its territorial waters. China also has other territorial disputes in the region, such as the Senkaku Islands, which are Japanese territory. But more broadly, I think that there's a general determination on the part of the Chinese Communist Party to expand Chinese influence and presence across the Indo-Pacific region and ultimately create a Chinese sphere of influence that extends through Southeast Asia and into Oceania and the Southwest Pacific, and would include isolating and coercing Australia as well.
Now, I think one of the issues that the West is facing is the failings and delays in their armament programs. So I think we can say that the Chinese, Koreans, Taiwanese, and Japanese have a much better manufacturing potential and base. We can see this, I think, with AUKUS, with all the delays. So how do you see this problem? What could the West do to deal with it?
I think firstly, they need to shift their mindset or alter their paradigm in terms of how they approach security threats. If you look at the situation in Europe right now, you're getting states in Europe that are now, the leaderships of those states are now actively talking about the risk of war between NATO and Russia in the next few years. And so they're starting to respond by shifting their defense postures and their military industrial capacities into a pre-war period. I think what needs to happen in the Indo-Pacific is something similar. With the potential threat of a crisis over the Taiwan Straits in the next few years, ongoing tension in the South China Sea, and of course, we shouldn't forget the Korean Peninsula with North Korea busily building up its nuclear capabilities. I think the United States, Japan, South Korea, and Australia and others all need to shift into a pre-war paradigm. In other words, what we're talking about is a degree of mobilization and preparation for war. And certainly, I think we're not really seeing that at this point in time here in Australia. You are seeing it to a degree in places such as Japan and South Korea and the US, but it's still moving very slowly. Time is not our friend here. We don't have the luxury of assuming that nothing bad will happen for the next decade. So therefore, we need to urgently shift our entire economies and industrial capacities to embrace a pre-war posture so that we can better deter Beijing from using military force and deter also Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang and ultimately avoid that war. But if we can't avoid it, then be in a better position to fight and win it.
Okay, what are the current problems does AUKUS have? What else would you list here?
Okay, in terms of AUKUS, I think that you have obviously to explain to your viewers, AUKUS is a technology sharing agreement. It's not a military alliance. Pillar 1 is about Australia acquiring nuclear-powered but conventionally armed submarines, initially 3 Virginia-class submarines, potentially 5, and then moving to a new design in the 2040s called SSN AUKUS. Pillar 1 obviously is a key aspect of it, but the capabilities that it will deliver in terms of those submarines won't start appearing until 2033 at the earliest. Pillar 2 is a technology sharing aspect in terms of critical and emerging technologies. There's a number of priority areas for Pillar 2, including advanced undersea warfare, AI and autonomous systems, electronic warfare, cyber capabilities, hypersonics, and quantum technologies. And other areas are starting to creep in as well, including space capabilities. So Pillar 2, that critical and emerging technologies piece, is about developing capabilities quickly that can close the gap between the West and China, particularly in some key priority areas, for example, hypersonics and quantum, to reinforce integrated deterrence. In both Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, things are moving too slowly. We're going to get capabilities too slowly. By the time we get the SSNs, for example, in 2033, a lot of the key developments and moves by China may have already settled a lot of the strategic dynamics in the Indo-Pacific region. Pillar 2 may be moving a little bit faster, but it still needs to go faster in terms of developing actual operational capability that is operationally deployed rather than just doing continuing research and development of these technologies. So I think speed is of the essence. Time is not our friend, and we need higher gear to actually achieve these goals.
Yeah, but the problem is it all doesn't seem very likely, like we know more or less what to do. I wanted to ask you now about the Wang Yi visit in Australia, but the first question I wanted to ask before. The Albanese government seems to omit dangerous PLA behavior and just not discuss this policy and those problems in public. What do you think about that?
Look, I think that there is concern, that maybe the need or the desire on the part of the current Australian government for stabilisation, as it's called, with Beijing, is seeing defence and security deprioritised. I don't think we should get overwrought about this. I think that Australia will continue to develop capabilities coming out of the Defence Strategic Review. We've got the National Defence Strategy that's about to be released in the next month or so. A lot will depend on what happens in that, and also a document known as the Integrated Investment Program, the IIP, and what comes out of the federal budget. If we start to see defence spending continuing to be flat or even being reduced, then I think there's real cause for concern. I think that there is a risk, that we overemphasize stabilization with China at the expense of security of Australia. I don't think we should make that mistake. And I think there are voices within the strategic policy community that are strongly advocating against going down that path. Beijing will take every opportunity to exploit our desire for stabilization. And basically, if we give them concessions in an effort to stabilize the relationship and perhaps boost trade or something along the lines of that, then Beijing will demand more concessions. So I think there is a risk that we talk ourselves into a corner here. It should not be stabilization at any cost. The Albanese government has this saying of we engage when we can, we disagree where we must, and we defend Australia's interests. I think the emphasis needs to be more on defending Australia's interests at this point in time, because even if China is no longer engaging in wolf warrior coercion of Australia as it did between 2015 and 2022, that hasn't changed their geostrategic goals and ambitions in terms of dominating the Indo-Pacific region, hasn't changed their intention to forcefully impose unification on Taiwan or to dominate the South China Sea. So, I think we do need to engage with China where it's useful, but we shouldn't go in wearing rose-colored glasses and assume that stabilization solves all our problems.
Studio Asia is an independent channel. I am neither looking for sponsors, nor asking you for donations. I value much more your comment under this interview. It means a lot to me, a lot. Subscribing and sharing helps me to be promoted by YouTube. I will appreciate it very, very much.
So how would you evaluate the recent Wang Yi visit? It seems like it was a win for China. I think the Albanese government gave in quite a lot here, or not?
Look, I think that the Wang Yi visit was most significant in terms of Wang Yi's meeting with former Prime Minister Paul Keating, which I think was highly inappropriate. The Australian government should never have permitted that. Essentially, Wang Yi directed an insult against the Australian government and the Australian people by holding that meeting with Keating, who has pro-China, anti-AUKUS, anti-US views. And I think to do it immediately after meeting with officials of the Australian government, including Foreign Minister Penny Wong, just demonstrated the contempt that the Chinese government holds for Australia and for Australian desires for stabilization. We obviously had meetings with Wang Yi, which delivered some perfunctory agreements and arrangements in terms of boosting trade and so forth. But as I said, that visit hasn't signaled that China somehow has seen the light and realizes that it should not engage in aggression in the Indo-Pacific region. China is still China. It is still engaging in a determination to impose its will and to create a Chinese sphere of influence. I think that the government needs to realize that no matter how many lobsters we sell, no matter how much wine we sell to China, they are still going to use their military power when they see fit to impose their will on the region.
And would there be a follow-up visit from the Chinese Prime Minister?
That's possibly in the cards. So obviously, the Australian government, would probably approve that. But I think that there needs to be caution in making sure that we don't go further down the slippery slope of concession after concession. Because I suspect that what will happen is that the Chinese Prime Minister will visit, and then the invitation will be suggested for Xi to visit Australia, but significant concessions have to be made on Australia's part, and we should reject that.
My last question, what are you going to research until the end of this year and then in the next one in 25? What is your interest? What do you think what could happen?
Well, my main focus at ASPI is on space policy and space security. So right at the moment, I'm writing a special report on national space strategy, the case for national space strategy. I'm writing that in combination with a colleague, Bex Shrimpton, who's the Director of Defence Strategy and National Security, and we're hoping to get that out by June 19th as a general release. After that, I'm doing work on deterrence and extended nuclear deterrence. So I'll be writing an awful lot about nuclear strategy and how Australia can step up and burden share alongside the United States in reinforcing the credibility of US extended nuclear deterrence, and whether that requires a degree of nuclear sharing on Australia's part. not necessarily by Australia hosting nuclear weapons and certainly not getting nuclear weapons, but in terms of Australia doing more to directly support the extended nuclear deterrence mission and operations. I'll obviously be doing a lot of analysis on Chinese military modernization, on China-Taiwan issues, and certainly since February of 2022, I've been writing extensively on Russia-Ukraine. So I'll be following that because the Ukraine war is entering a fairly decisive phase in terms of the risk that Russia could win there and then be emboldened to potentially threaten NATO directly in a couple of years' time. So there's a range of issues for me to work on this year, going into next year, that will be quite enjoyable and interesting for me.
Malcolm, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
I have so many other fantastic interviews on this and similar topics. Please check out my channel.